Let's start off with kind of a no-duh statement, but plagues were kind of rampant. Towns, cities, armies, navies, they could all lose a large fraction of people from what many viewed as an apocalyptic act of God. Sanitation wasn't actually the issue, by the way. Even peasants had access to soaps, outhouses, and teeth-cleaning mints. The issue was that malnutrition, pseudoscience, medical practices, and a general lack of experience against the variety of new plagues made treatment kind of difficult. So nowadays we all know what germs are because we can see them with microscopes. Back then, the answer to stop paninis included hunting down non-Christians, hunting down black cats, hunting down vampiric witches. You get where I'm going with this. And also praying. Yes, they did quarantine people, but it didn't work as well as you want when you've got people catapulting plagues into enemy cities to intentionally spread plagues. Speaking of that medicine that was not as effective as modern medicine, some of the proposed cures for day-to-day ailments were kind of wacky. For example, cobwebs were used to treat warts, and ale was made of crushed and roasted eggshells, leaves, and petals of marigold flowers. Yeah, that's how they treated plagues. Which, yeah, to nobody's surprise, didn't work too well. If a medieval soldier was wounded in battle, he didn't have to worry. As soon as somebody got cut, a doctor, following the recommendations of the king's personal surgeon, would whip out his hoo-ha and pee on your wound. And this wasn't just for like fresh cuts either. Fresh urine was used to treat sores, burns, bites, and well, anything you could think of. It was gross, but apparently it worked. The ammonia in the urine would help keep cuts from getting infected. And in life or death situations, it's worth it. I know people still do that today in like survival situations, so like I get it, but when a British family had filled their chamber pots and stuffed their house with waste and rotting foods, well, they were expected to clean it out. Now officially, they were supposed to gather up their whole mess and carry outside city limits, which was one of those ideas that sounded great on paper, but in practice, nobody was about to waste their time doing that when there was a perfectly good street to dump things right outside their front door. Trash piled up in front of people's homes, ranging from old chicken bones to emptied out chamber pots. Legend has it that people dumped their chamber pots out of their windows so often that chivalrous men were expected to let women walk on the inside of the sidewalk so that any raining feces would fall on their head instead. Oh, chivalry. Nobody even tried to stop people from dumping things on the streets until the 14th century, when King Edward II introduced England's first law against dumping poop on the road. Even then, though, it didn't really have much of an effect. The trash kept piling up and people just adjusted. Wealthy people would carry perfumed cloths against their nose whenever they stepped outside to keep from upchucking, and the king started hiring professionals to clear the filth off the road. And as awful as the roads smelled on an average day, they were so much worse after it rained because, well, these roads are made of dirt, cobblestone, and they were designed to slope into a rainwater ditch in the middle of the road to prevent flooding. This would have been great if it weren't for all the trash. So all of these rainwater ditches were stuffed full of trash. So by the time it actually rained, they were useless. Instead of stopping floods, these clogged ditches would overflow, and that would dislodge the months of trash that built up, which I'm sure you can guess, so gross. And when the sky eventually cleared up, the roads would be covered in wet trash and feces, slowly drying in the sun and stinking up the entire town. We're moving on before I upchuck. Unless you were wealthy, most homes in medieval England didn't actually have floors. Beneath a lot of folks' feet was nothing more than compacted earth covered in rushes, herbs, and grass. Covering the dirt with plants did help to keep the house warm, but it was very expensive. Also, food would fall into rushes and get buried there, luring rats and insects into homes. And it wasn't like anybody really had the time to deep clean. Usually they'd clear out the top layer and put on something new, but the bottom layer, where all the disgusting things was, it would stay untouched, often for decades. One Dutch visitor complained that English homes were harboring vomiting, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. Yep, moving on. I know I've already covered stinky places today, but few places stank worse than the River Thames. During the Middle Ages, it was considered normal practice for butchers to gather up all their unused, rotten meat, bundle it up, drag it out to the bridge, and dump it in the river. This was so common that the bridge earned itself the nickname Butcher's Bridge, and it was the most disgusting place in the whole country. It was famous for being covered in dried redness and pieces of animal entrails that had spilled out of butchers' carts. It took until the 19th century before anybody put an end to the stench. But for 500 years, London's Great River was one of the smelliest places on earth. Growing old was a challenge back then. Only about a third of everybody born reached adulthood, and giving birth was extremely dangerous, with mothers, offspring, or both not making it out alive. Across society at that time, the average life expectancy was only about 35 years. Men usually lived a little longer than women, and the rich, of course, often lived much longer than the poor. Still, it's pretty wild that giving birth was more risky than going into battle. During the Middle Ages, violent criminals and thieves faced pretty severe consequences if caught, and there were numerous petty problems that also received cruel and unusual punishments. Being a vagrant or getting caught begging was against the law in most European locales. Peasants were forbidden to marry without their lord's permission, and in some places, women could even be punished for gossiping too much. Oh bother. Take me away now, folks. Surprisingly, even playing football became illegal in England back in 1314. In the early part of the Middle Ages, determining guilt or innocence involved a brutal practice called trial by ordeal. So if you were a woman, you were suspected of witchcraft, well, let's see, what were we gonna do to you? Alright, tie you up and toss you into the water. Now, if you survive, you're innocent. If you die, you're guilty. And seeing you've already been tied up before being thrown in, you can guess how many guilty witches there were. As time passed, trial by jury started to replace the trial by ordeal, but punishments during this era were still incredibly harsh compared to today's standards. Public executions were common, as were floggings and, well, other harmful things. Corporal punishment and forced labor were routinely levied against criminals and evildoers as well. Even petty crimes like thievery, pickpocketing were given harsh retribution. One of the most dreadful crimes somebody could commit was high treason. Betraying one's king was such a heinous act that resulted in an unimaginably cruel punishment. The condemned person would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged towards execution, and would be subjected to the rope necklace treatment, but then cut down just before death. While fully conscious, they would be disemboweled, and their entrails would be burned before their eyes. Finally, an axe would be swung to sever their head from their body. Then, in what served as a brutal warning to others, their head would be displayed for all to see. And that, folks, is what we call overkill. Life back then was divided into different classes. As has been the case in most eras, those at the top had a pretty good life. They were the ones with power, money, high status. In most communities, the king technically owned all the land in an area, and he would lease it out to noble barons in exchange for an oath of their loyalty. Then, these nobles had the freedom to govern their land and impose taxes as they pleased. This privilege for the barons came at a great cost to those below them, the serfs. That was the poor mass of people who had no land, no rights, and were treated pretty poorly. They toiled on the land and brutally worked 6 days a week from dawn till dusk. Per the feudal system, they were forced to produce crops, raise livestock, and offer some other value to pay their liege lord for the use of the land. And the grind never ended. If you were born into the lower class, it was extremely likely you would remain there for your entire life. There was no social mobility or opportunity to work through one's birth position. Instead, the poor masses simply kept working hard and toiling away with no chance of ever improving their lives. Speaking of lower class, one unusual job that became popular was that of being a leech collector. The medical profession had a constant need for leeches at the time, which created an opportunity for people to make a living by gathering the little fluid-sucking creatures. Now, it wasn't like a really hard task, but it was gross. To be able to do this job, you gotta enter a suitable body of water and just wait. Wait for what? For the leeches to attach themselves to you. Now, another job that offered slightly more income was that of being a fuller. Fullers were more common than leech collectors, and they could earn 3 times as much as a peasant working in the fields. Their responsibility was to remove oil, dirt, and other impurities from newly woven cloth. The most effective method they used was stomping on the cloth with their feet inside a barrel filled with human urine. This process would go on for hours and hours, dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. Yeah, no thanks. During medieval times, the Catholic Church held immense power and influence across Europe. It had great wealth and authority too, and for one, it was exempt from taxes. But it still compelled peasants to pay a tithe of 10% of their earnings to the church. Also, peasants were obligated to dedicate their time and labor to the church's lands without compensation. The vast resources and political strength of the church allowed it to permeate nearly every aspect of medieval society, and because they had such power, worship was essentially forced. After all, who would mount a fight against an organization with that much of an ability to ruin your life? As a leader of the church and the earthly representative of God, the Pope held a level of power that rivaled and often surpassed most of Europe's monarchs. Although popes did not directly command armies, their influence was so significant that they could call for crusades. And, well, religious minorities faced the constant threat of persecution and death due to their unpopular belief systems. Because of the sheer dominance of the Catholic Church, diversity in religious practices existed at great risk to those who dared to differ. Worship was very power-driven from the top down at the time, and if you went against it, you literally risked your life. And people wonder why I'm so anti-Catholicism.
Number 10. Washrooms. Imagine stepping inside a castle, expecting the grandeur of medieval majesty, only to be greeted by a combination of communal bench toilets and the worst smell one could possibly imagine. Welcome to medieval times. Privacy was a foreign concept, so you better get comfortable with your mates. And when it came to waste disposal strategies in medieval times, well, it was quite simple. Chuck it down the cesspool and hope for the best. Throw it away and don't turn back. Now, the location of said cesspool, that really matters when you're building a castle. Take the Erfurt disaster, for example. In 1184 in Erfurt, Germany, at least 60 people, many which of high nobility, are thought to have drowned by falling into a deep cesspool. How horrible is that? They were immersed in politics. They were negotiating a peace treaty when all of a sudden, the floor collapsed. I couldn't imagine a worse way to go out, really. That one stings. Number 9. Bathing. Bathing was a medieval quest in itself, with fresh water and bathtubs being a rare commodity. It also didn't help that diseases at the time were frolicking freely amongst the lower class, turning the castle into a nest of disease. For the nobility, wooden tubs draped in linens were filled with steaming water, scented with herbs and flowers. This was the best they could do at the time, a bath with flowers in it. It's the worst bath bomb ever, my gosh. Servants would fetch water that's been heated over open fires, a testament to the labor behind every drop of warmth. And for many, bathing remained a distant dream inside of these stone fortresses. Most of the time you're going to bed pretty stinky. Number 8, crowded. Castles were always pretty crowded, believe it or not. For those who prefer a fortress of solitude, the bustling life of a medieval castle might not have been for you. Castles require a considerable workforce to manage daily tasks. They were populated not only by numerous servants, but also by extensive families of the lords and ladies. This could span generations and get pretty crowded. Because let's be honest, if you knew somebody with a castle, you would beg them to move in. Let me clean the floors, I don't care, just take me in, give me a corner. This inevitably led to crowded living conditions, and the presence of both servants and a vast array of family members made the concept of privacy, well, virtually non-existent in a medieval castle. Number 7, dungeons. Below the bustling depths of medieval castles lay the dungeons. It's exactly what it sounds like. Realms of dread where you never saw the light of day. These medieval chambers were full of despair and darkness. Dungeons were these dark prisons that were damp, airless, and essentially forgotten by the world above. The air was thick with the scent of decay and waste. Now let's say it's the Dark Ages and you were taken as a prisoner of war. Well, if you were nobility, you got personal quarters with a fireplace and you were eating meat and drinking wine. It wasn't the worst at all. If you're lucky, they might give you a wooden bucket full of water to wash yourself up while you wait, and even a chamber pot. If you were a commoner, on the other hand, this was a little different. At most, the church guaranteed your survival, but you still stayed in a dungeon until hostilities were over and prisoners were exchanged, so a lot less meat in that one. You'll get bread and water, but you may also be put to work, so it's gonna suck either way you spin it. Number 6, punishments. What are some of the worst ways to be punished in a medieval castle, you ask? Well, let's do it. I feel like just being locked in the dark is scary enough, but I couldn't imagine the rat punishment. Oh boy, the rat punishment is not for the faint-hearted. If you've seen Game of Thrones, you'll know exactly where I'm going here. Rat punishment involves placing a single rat inside a steel bucket. Now this bucket would be held against the prisoner, usually over their abdomen, which already I bet is very uncomfortable and rather terrifying. But once the bucket begins to heat up, well, that's when the real trouble begins. Desperate to escape the heating container, the rat will begin to burrow through the only soft surface that it can find in order to survive, which in this case was your tummy. Yeah, not great. The surface was the prisoner's flesh. Yeah, you thought Stuart Little was cute? Think again. If he was born in the Dark Ages, he would have had a horrible job. Little high, little ho. Number 5, fires everywhere. In the early chapters of the medieval ages, castle kitchens were made entirely of wood. Awesome. This of course led to an obvious problem. Open flames next to a wall made out of timber. Obviously it lit up a blaze. Obviously things didn't go so well. Thing is, in a world where electricity doesn't exist, not having fire around wasn't an option. You needed it to see, you needed it back then to stay warm, but eventually something would light up, and that's when disaster hit. The most notable disaster was the Great Fire of 1666. 666, that's always welcoming. Historians believe the Great Fire of 1666 started with a baker's oven, specifically the baker of King Charles II. The fire started near London Bridge on Pudding Lane, and it took no time to spread. Also, imagine living on a road called Pudding Lane. What kind of Looney Tunes name is that? Yeah, I live on the corner of Pudding Lane and Jubilee Avenue. Come visit. Number 4, medieval stairwells. In medieval castles, stairwells were intentionally constructed to spiral clockwise if you were going up. Now they did this to benefit the defenders during an attack, seeing as most people were right-handed. That's me, I'm right-handed. Are you right-handed, Chris?
Left.
Left, we got a left. I'm like, don't you come up my stairs, buddy, you're gonna get poked. As attackers climbed the stairs, the central column would obstruct their right arm, making it difficult for them to swing their swords effectively. They'd be like, they'd be reaching around. It's not good. Meanwhile, defenders coming downstairs would have their right arm free, allowing them to wield their weapons with much more force and precision. Also, you're coming downstairs, so you're like, It's a surprise, it's terrifying. This clever design, evident in castles in France, showcased medieval engineering specifically designed to maximize defensive strategies. Do left-handed people still exist? I mean, Chris, you're left-handed obviously. Comment down below if you're a lefty. I want to see how many are really out there. Comment with just your left hand, actually. Let's see how good you are. Number 3, castle floors. In medieval castles, floor cleanliness was managed through surprising methods. They didn't have a Swiffer back then, so it was a little more rough. The floors were often made of stone, of course, and they were covered with rushes or straw to help insulate the rooms and to help absorb spills and conceal dirt. Medieval carpet, really, it was horrible medieval carpet back then. These straw piles could be easily replaced or topped up when it became too spoiled, if you want to say that. Servants would occasionally sweep, but the primary method of cleaning involved removing the old rushes and then laying down fresh ones. Imagine coming home to a fresh rush. How lovely. In more comfortable settings, herbs like lavender and chamomile were mixed in with the straw to combat animal waste, odor, and pests, subtly contributing to a more pleasant living environment amidst the castle's horrible conditions. Yeah, it's my lavender carpet. Come on in. Okay. Easy there, Prince. Number 2, religion. Every medieval castle had a chapel, almost all the time. While they kept prisoners locked away in the darkest of all places, they would seek answers from the Lord. That's cool. Love when humans are horribly evil and then look to the light. These sacred spaces served as the spiritual heart of the castle, reflecting the societal norm where daily life and religious practice were intertwined. They were all one. Castles, home to the nobility, upheld the obligation of maintaining a chapel, not only for spiritual salvation, but also as a symbol of their divine right to rule, of course. It's my castle because big man said so. Shoo. Daily practices within these walls included mass, prayers, and meditation. Of course, attended by the castle's inhabitants and all of their guests. So yeah, no sleeping in on Sundays. Sorry about that. And finally, number 1, rats. In medieval times, rats were a deadly threat, thriving within the densely populated and unsanitary conditions of towns and definitely castles. A lot of rats in a castle, that's for sure. These rodents were notorious for spreading diseases, most infamously the Black Death in the 14th century. It was believed to be carried by fleas living on rats, so this plague ended up decimating Europe's population, wiping out nearly 1/3 of its inhabitants. Rats also posed a significant risk to food supplies because they would gnaw through grain storage and they would contaminate practically everything in sight. If they were chewing through your stomach, they were also chewing through your supplies, okay?
How about we start off with the first thing that popped into my mind, animal court. Yep, Fido and Mittens could be dragged in front of a criminal court back in the day if they didn't follow animal law. There are records of at least 85 animal trials that took place during medieval times, and the tales vary from the tragic to the absurd. By far the most serial offenders were pigs, accused and convicted of chewing off body parts and even eating tiny humans. Most were found guilty and sentenced to the rope necklace or even being burned at the stake like traditional witches. In 1386, a convicted pig was dressed in a waistcoat, gloves, drawers, and a human mask for its execution. Granted, it wasn't just pigs that felt the hand of the law though. In 1474, a court found a rooster guilty of the unnatural crime of laying an egg. Unwanted rats often found themselves on the receiving end of a strongly worded letter asking them to get the heck out. And curiously enough, there was a trial of dolphins in Marseille in 1596. Granted, not all the trials ended in brutality. One donkey, which found herself the victim of unwanted advances, was proclaimed innocent after a strong recommendation from a commons prior, declaring her to be a virtuous and well-behaved animal. Hey look, if anybody wants to hold court for modern dogs that chew up furniture, be my guest. I don't think much surprises me anymore. Well, let's see. Has anybody heard about the dead Pope trial? Alright, picture the late 800s, a tumultuous time for popes as Charlemagne's once mighty empire crumbled into scattered different areas, each eyeing Rome's treasury. The papacy weakened, sought alliances with secular leaders to maintain influence. Enter Bishop Formosus of Portus, a rising figure in Catholic circles managing church matters across Europe. Despite commendable work, this bishop found himself on the wrong side of political disputes. Accused of crimes under church law, he was convicted, defrocked, and excommunicated by Pope John VIII. But, in the intricate dance of medieval politics, his excommunication was lifted 6 years later. Released from his oath, he returned to his diocese and in a twist of fate, became Pope in 891. When he died in 896, his legacy remained tangled in political webs. Enter Pope Stephen VI, pressured by folks who harbored a grudge against the previous pope. The infamous Cadaver Synod unfolded, a grotesque spectacle where the previous pope's rotting corpse was put on trial. Now Pope Stephen appointed himself prosecutor, hurling insults at the lifeless scandalous remains, accusing the former pope of posthumous crimes. The charges ranged from performing bishop duties after promising not to, assuming the papacy, to conspiring against a previous pope. In a macabre climax, the 3 fingers used for blessings were hacked off, the papal crown removed, and the body tossed into the Tiber River. The aftermath saw monks retrieving the corpse, rumors of miraculous events, and local bishops staging a Vatican coup. Decrees of the Cadaver Synod were annulled, reinstated, and the bones were shuffled between resting places. So hopefully the poor guy is finally resting in peace, because that's just wild. Y'all have heard about trial by combat, right? Even though it was technically first practiced by Germanic peoples, it was sometimes used to settle disputes in medieval Europe. Not everybody was allowed to fight, but there are records of monasteries fighting other monasteries and wives fighting their husbands. Generally the loser would be executed, but this didn't always happen. In 979, the royal court in the Holy Roman Empire set up a trial by combat between Count Gero of Elseben and a Saxon named Waldo. The historical record isn't super duper clear about why the men fought, but Waldo brought some kind of charge against Gero, and Gero was arrested. Look, back in the day you didn't need a million pages of evidence and Harvey Specter to win a case, okay? So in the battle, Gero cut Waldo's neck, but Waldo disabled Gero with a blow to the head, winning the fight. Right after beating Gero, however, Waldo collapsed dead. So you'd think dying would have ruined Waldo's victory, but the judges still insisted that the dead man won. Since Gero was a technical loser, Emperor Otto II ordered for the count to be decapitated, so nobody really won this one. If you thought we were gonna make it through today without a single witchcraft case, you'd be mistaken. Stadlin of Voltigen was a Swiss farmer who lived in the municipality of Voltigen sometime between 1392 and 1406. So one year when his crop yield was better than his neighbors, rumors spread that he was a sorcerer. It was said that he only had such a good yield because he used magic to transport crops from other people's fields. He could also supposedly control the weather and caused a local woman to miscarry 7 times in a row. Eventually, Stadlin was arrested and confessed to being a sorcerer after being tormented. He claimed that he was in contact with demons, and those demons would summon thunderstorms after he tossed a black chicken up into the air. As for his neighbor's trouble with bearing offspring, he said her infertility was the result of a lizard he buried on her property. He also revealed that his wife was a witch and recommended that the authorities not believe her if she said otherwise. For his confession, this man was burned at the stake, while his wife got the same punishment for not confessing. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't, damned all around. I think we're gonna hit on all of the old expressions today, so we might as well get trial by fire out of the way now. In late 15th century Florence, the Dominican preacher and reformer Girolamo Savonarola was one of the most powerful men in the city. He attacked the government and the Catholic Church, and also claimed to be a prophet in touch with God. In 1494, Florence became a democratic republic, and Savonarola became its new leader. Didn't last long though. 3 years later, Savonarola was excommunicated by the Pope for his rebellious behavior and preaching. So the next year, a rival named Francesco da Puglia challenged Savonarola to a trial by fire to prove that the Pope was correct to banish him. The logic of the trial was this: if Savonarola could walk through fire without being burned, then it would show that God was on his side and the Pope was wrong. So the trial was held on April 7th. A crowd gathered to watch the spectacle, because, why not? What else are you gonna do? But Savonarola and his supporters ended up arguing with the other side until a thunderstorm broke out and put out the fire. So after that fiasco, Savonarola was arrested, confessed to being a false prophet, and was sentenced to the rope necklace with 2 of his supporters. Next up, we have a case of somebody just trying to make a damn living. John Rykener was a 14th century Londoner who lived quite the double life. Not Hannah Montana style, but just wait. He was a playboy who had very fun encounters with countless women, for pleasure, but he also dressed up as a woman and worked as a lady of the night under the name Eleanor. Sadly, one day John was picked up by city officials after being caught with a client in a stall in the street. The client told authorities that he paid for intercourse with John, but had no idea that John was, biologically male. John, dressed as Eleanor, admitted the truth of the situation and then turned over a pretty embarrassing list of other men he'd slept with for money. 3 of John's clients were aristocratic scholars, and many of the others were chaplains, friars, and priests, which that goes against their vows. John seemed to have a thing for holy people, because he also slept with nuns for free while dressed as a man, because gotta be charitable about it. Sadly, there aren't any records about what happened to him after his arrest, but if he wasn't let go for his embarrassing testimony, he was probably convicted of sodomy. You know the old saying, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it? Yeah, we're gonna revisit that in just a second. So in medieval times, leprosy was thought to be highly contagious. Medieval Europeans were very paranoid about catching the disease, so lepers were shunned and segregated from mainstream society. I'm seeing similarities to the AIDS epidemic. and the stigma that has followed the condition to this day. So lepers were not only considered unclean, but also suspicious and untrustworthy. In spring of 1321, a story began to spread in southern France that lepers were plotting to poison wells and infect the entire country with leprosy so they could overthrow the government and take control of France. Now, of course, the entire story was fake, but King Philip V ordered that all the country's lepers be arrested and put on trial for treason. Hysterical mobs killed lepers with impunity, while those who actually got trials were tormented and burned at the stake. By the end of the year, when the frenzy had largely subsided, thousands of lepers had died in massacres and trials. Nobody in power bothered to apologize until 1338, when the Pope, then centered in the French city of Avignon, acknowledged that the lepers were innocent. About damn time. Next up in our type of trials is none other than trials by ordeal, which were rites designed to invoke divine intervention for a just outcome. The belief was that if a defendant were truly innocent, God would step in and work a miracle to avert a miscarriage of justice. Far from a theatrical charade, people of the medieval world really believed in God's vigilant oversight, incapable of allowing an innocent to be wrongly accused. Now, these trials were not for the faint-hearted. Defendants faced challenges like walking over hot irons or retrieving stones from boiling water, their innocence hinging on the timely healing of inflicted injuries. In a more bizarre version involving cold water, bound suspects were tossed in to sink or float, as water, believed to be pure, had the power to repel sin. One intriguing but historically questionable tale involves Emma of Normandy, accused of adultery with Bishop Elfwine of Winchester. Convinced of her innocence, Emma volunteered for the ordeal of hot iron. The Archbishop of Canterbury agreed, but only with rigorous conditions. To quote him, "Let the ill-famed woman walk 9 paces, with bare feet on 9 red-hot plowshares, 4 to clear herself and 5 to clear the bishop. If she falters, if she does not press one of the plowshares fully with her feet, if she has harmed the one least bit, then let her be judged a fornicator." So Emma, led by bishops, walked the red-hot path in a church, invoking divine intervention. According to chroniclers, she navigated this entire thing unscathed, seemingly oblivious to the searing heat. So afterwards, her feet were examined, or so the report goes, and they were found to be uninjured. So, hello, a miracle. Emma was found innocent of the charge and free to go, with all her confiscated property restored. Hey, I love a good miracle story, don't you? So remember earlier when I mentioned how animals used to be put on trial? They weren't alone in that. Any kind of critter could be sent to court. Like, even insects weren't immune to prosecution. Not that I particularly want them to be. Throughout this time period in Europe, there were many cases of court-sanctioned bug bashing, with church authorities acting as a sort of holy pest control company. Pope Stephen VI even once sprayed a pesticide of holy water around Rome's rural outskirts. I wonder, like, holy exterminators? Could that be a thing? Pulpit pronouncements were often used in conjunction with trials, and on occasion the insects would even be told in writing, or verbally, that they would like it much better in a neighboring village. In 1478 in Switzerland, seed beetles were prosecuted for wreaking havoc on crops. After much public reprimanding of the insects and head scratching from local dignitaries, the Bishop of Lausanne issued a cease and desist order to the bugs. Now the insects ignored this, so then the bishop ordered them to leave the land within 6 days, proclaiming that these creatures were not passengers on Noah's Ark and were so open, and ergo were open to excommunication. If they refused to leave, they were ordered to appear in Avanches to explain their refusal to budge. The records don't mention whether they turned up in Avanches, but the next year they were back, and the church blamed the pest's continuing presence on the sins of the people. Sins which they could offset by coughing up more tithe money, incidentally. Wow, I'm so shocked. More money for the church so we could get rid of things? And since I'm in a funny mood, let's end today with another buggy case, if you will. In Mainz, Germany, local people brought a prosecution against some Spanish flies. Now, if you're unaware of them, they're also known as a blister beetle and are dangerous to livestock and ruinous to vegetation. Hence, the furious Rhineland farmers were happy to see the church court weigh in on these mischievous mini-beasts. In view of their small size, the judge appointed for them a learned defender who represented his clients with great dignity. Well, to the shock and surprise of nobody, the court banished them, kindly approving an allocated plot of land for the creepy crawlies to retire to. Now, we're not sure if the puny prisoners made it to their reservation, but any failure on this case was likely pinned on the townsfolk's lack of religion. Go figure.
Anyone watching have a fear of rodents? If so, then be glad you weren't around in the medieval times. This punishment would be used on a variety of prisoners, and if it wasn't stopped soon enough, they'd surely die. A prisoner would be strapped down to a table, then they'd have a slit cut into their belly. Next, rats would be placed on the victim and covered with a bowl, and on top of the bowl would be burning hot coals. This would cause things to get a little too hot for the rats, who would start getting desperate to escape, and they'd have nowhere to go but down. They'd start gnawing at the victim's stomach, trying to burrow into it. Not only would this be incredibly painful, but disgusting and horrifying as well. Nasty dungeon rats trying to claw their way into your body, just horrific. This wasn't just used as a form of punishment either, it was also great for interrogation. I mean, try holding on to information when you have rats tunneling into your bowels. So what would happen if you made counterfeit money back in the day? Well, surely that would just land you some time in the slammer, right? Maybe a big fine. No, you'd be boiled alive. Pretty self-explanatory. You'd be placed in a big pot of hot liquid, water, oil, sometimes even molten lead, and then you'd slowly get cooked alive. This was actually a practice used across different cultures. In the Holy Roman Empire, for example, coin forgers would often find themselves boiled to death. In Britain, King Henry VIII used it for those who'd killed someone using poison. Now, this was brutal as it sounds. The heat would sear through the skin, burning limbs and organs. Sometimes the liquid wasn't even boiling when the person was put in initially, just drawing things out even longer, slowly and slowly boiling to death. For anyone enduring this punishment, death wouldn't come soon enough. The agony was prolonged, and even if they tried to speed it up by submerging their head, it was still a slow and painful end, usually taking hours. Yikes. This one goes out to all you claustrophobics out there. Immurement, which is to build someone into an enclosed space. It's basically live entombment. Immurement has been known to happen all over the world in different periods of time, but this was especially a thing in Christendom during the medieval times. The punishment was used as a form of religious punishment for the worst of crimes. The victim would be placed in a confined area, usually a room or a wall, and then brick or stone would be built around them, sealing them into the area. It was rare for the victim to ever be let out, so they'd slowly die inside the enclosed space. Yeah, this one is pretty much the definition of a make your skin crawl punishment. Anything where you're just trapped inside a small confined space is just the worst to me, like being buried alive. This would be a more drawn out death though. There'd be more air than in a coffin 6 feet underground, but not enough. It would slowly get harder and harder to breathe. On top of that, thirst and starvation would kick in. You'd probably be wishing they'd have put you out of your misery in a more violent but quicker way. Being drawn and quartered was one of the most brutal punishments in the medieval times. First, the person would be tied to a wooden frame or cart and dragged with horses through the streets. This was the drawn part. It was meant to publicly shame and humiliate them, as well as bring them to their final destination, and here's where things got even worse. They'd be hanged by the neck, but not to the point of death. Instead, they'd be cut down while still alive, and now comes the quartered part. Their body would be sliced open, usually at the abdomen, and their entrails would be pulled out. Sometimes these would be burned right in front of them. Finally, their body would be divided into various parts, and each one would be taken to a different place to be displayed as a warning to others. People who'd committed treason were usually the ones who'd have this to look forward to. Take William Wallace, for example, who was punished for leading the fight for Scottish freedom by being drawn by 4 horses, one attached to each limb. Then the rest went pretty much the same way I just outlined. Oh, and this punishment stuck around until the 1800s, if you can believe that. What other punishments could criminals in the medieval times have to look forward to? Well, for killers and thieves, there was being broken on the wheel. This one was pretty blunt, no pun intended. After committing a terrible crime, the criminal would have their limbs tied to the spokes of a large wheel. Then a big dude with a big hammer or blunt object of some kind would show up, and their job was to rain blows on the victim's limbs, one by one, breaking them. In terms of how long this would last, that would depend on the severity of the crime. If the executioner wanted to be merciful, he'd start with lethal blows first. If not, then he'd start with the ankles and work his way up. Sometimes it could take days for the victim to finally die of their injuries, and after all the bones were broken, the victim would often be set on display for a while just to deter other folks from committing the same crime. Crushing punishment. Now, we've discussed a lot of punishments for people who were already deemed guilty, but what about people still awaiting trial? Well, turns out they weren't always just kept in cells. Prisoners who were on the fence about pleading guilty or not guilty to a crime might sometimes need to be coerced. Unlike today, where certain bargains can be made in order to enter a plea, in Europe back in the day, you'd just get crushed. A prisoner would be strapped down, and then heavy objects like stones would be placed on them until they either gave in or died. They'd usually die. And it was pretty gruesome. Their bones would usually break and pierce the skin. This practice was used for a long time too, beginning in the 13th century, lasting all the way up to the 17th. So why would anyone refuse to enter a plea in the first place? Well, this was usually to retain one's property. See, if a prisoner said anything and was found to be guilty, they'd be stripped of their property, leaving their family with nothing. But if they refused to say anything and were executed anyway, their property would still stay in the family, being passed down to their next of kin. Getting crushed by stones is one thing, but how about a big heavy animal, like a 12,000-pound elephant, for example? Let's move out of medieval Europe for a moment and into medieval Southeast Asia. Enemy soldiers, tax evaders, thieves, all could die at the hands, or rather the feet, of an elephant. Usually it would involve the criminal being crushed by the elephant, but at times other methods of death were also used. Some trained elephants with blades fitted to their tusks would be used to slice at the victim. Typically the elephant would just step on the person though, either killing them instantly or drawing things out longer, all dependent on how the executioner wanted to go about it. This form of punishment was used in India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and it was used for a long time, as recently as the 19th century. Now, having your head lopped off may seem like a pretty easy way to go compared to most of the stuff we've discussed so far, but that's if you were lucky enough to receive a nice clean cut. Being beheaded by a sword was the preferred way to go. An axe was less efficient, and it was especially bad if you didn't have a very skilled executioner to deliver the blow. There are accounts of people being hacked at multiple times before their head was finally detached from their body, which would have been pretty horrific and excruciating. Overall though, this was seen as a more honorable way to die, as it wasn't supposed to be a drawn out process and was said to be pretty painless. Not that they'd have any way of really knowing that. This was a death usually reserved for knights, nobles, and royals. Beheading was practiced throughout the medieval era and long after it, with the last beheading in England being carried out in 1747. How were violent criminals dealt with in medieval Europe? Well, violently, as we've already discussed, but this particular punishment was reserved for those who attempted to kill someone with a blade, and it kind of plays out like a really twisted game. They'd take the assailant's hand, lay it down on a table, and then shove the criminal's own blade all the way through their hand, pinning it to the table. Next, the criminal would have to get their hand off the table, but the catch, they weren't allowed to use their free hand to pull the blade out. Imagine trying to unpin your hand from a table with a knife stuck through it, your hand just pressing into the guard, slipping up and down the blade. Yeah, kind of makes you cringe just thinking about it. What would happen to you back in the day if you had a foul mouth? This is where the tongue terror comes in. For those that committed blasphemy or heresy back in the medieval times, a device known as a tongue terror would be used to silence them for good, or at least make it much harder to enunciate. First, their mouth would be forced open, then the device would be clamped onto the tongue with a screw at the back. Not hard to imagine where things go next. Let her rip. This one is pretty barbaric. Not lethal, but you'd probably be wishing it was.
Number 10, marriage contracts. In addition to religious ceremonies, some marriages were formalized through written contracts. These contracts outlined the terms and conditions of the marriage, including the distribution of property and responsibilities of each partner. Individuals, especially women, had very limited say in their choices of a spouse. Marriage was often seen as a social contract rather than a personal choice, and family interest took precedence. Marriage laws were often influenced by local customs and traditions, and sometimes specific laws imposed by ruling authorities. Breaking these laws could have serious consequences, as the contract might outline the responsibilities and obligation of each spouse within the marriage. This could include matters such as the wife's role in managing the household and the husband's responsibility in providing financial support. Number 9, social class. The social classes of the individuals involved playing a significant role in medieval marriages. Nobles and aristocrats had different customs and expectations compared to peasants or the commoner. Members of the urban middle class, including craftsmen and merchants, often had more autonomy in choosing their spouses. Marriages were also still influenced by economic considerations, but personality compatibility played also a larger role. Among the lower classes, marriages were often more community-based with less emphasis on individual choices, and local customs and traditions played a significant role in the matchmaking process. Regardless of the social class, marriages were still subject to the regulations of the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. Bans as public announcements were required before the wedding, and the ceremony took place in the church. Number 8. Clandestine marriages. In some cases, couples would engage in clandestines or secret marriages without the knowledge or consent of their families. These marriages were often conducted in private and could lead to social and legal consequences if discovered. Among the lower classes, marriages were often community-based and left emphasized as individual choices, as mentioned before. And in situations where individuals were too young to marry legally or did not have parental consent, these marriages were provided in a way for couples to formalize their union without adhering a legal requirement. Clandestine marriages were often private ceremonies with minimal or to no witnesses. Couples might even exchange vows and promises without the elaborate rituals associated with traditional weddings. Number 7. Chastity belts. Despite popular belief, there is actually a limited evidence supporting the widespread use of chastity belts in medieval times. The historical accuracy of these devices, purportedly designed to prevent infidelity, is debated among historians. Some objects claimed to be medieval chastity belts have been found, but their authenticity is often disputed. Some of these artifacts are believed to be later reproductions or even Victorian-era creations rather than genuine medieval time items. Even if chastity belts were used in some extent, their purpose might have been more symbolic than actual practical, and they could have also represented the ideas of preserving virtue and fidelity or societal expectations regarding to the woman's behavior. Number 6. Polygamy and concubinage. While monogamy was generally the norm, there were instances of polygamous relationships or marriages, particularly among the nobility. Kings and lords might have multiple wives or concubines, often for political reasons. The Catholic Church generally discouraged polygamy, and monogamy was the norm according to the church doctrine. However, some rulers sought papal dispensations or found ways to justify polygamous unions for political reasons. As medieval societies evolved, so did the attitudes towards polygamy and concubinage, and later, the medieval period and the transition to the Renaissance saw a decline in these practices, influenced, of course, by the changing social and religious and legal norms.
Number 5. Have more than 10 offspring. Yes, I know this can be a touchy subject, so just bear with me here. I'm not calling giving birth evil by any means, or having multiple offspring by choice evil. I more mean that back in the day, it was a woman's job to essentially reproduce as many offspring as possible to help around the home and to continue on the family name. As somebody who has zero interest in ever reproducing, and that is my personal choice, I have many friends who have, and I will be a fantastic aunt. The thought of giving birth once is terrifying, never mind that often. I read about a lady who had 17 offspring, and sure, while some of those might have been multiple births, I can't even imagine the pain. Or also just raising that many little ones, being responsible for that many little ones. The stress, no thank you. All the props to them, but evil because they were forced to, not because they wanted to. Number 4, take up the waist. After that last one, let's start this point with a fun fact, shall we? So the British word for toilet, loo, derives from the French gardez l'eau, meaning, watch out for the water. Gardez l'eau, je parle français. This comes from the fact that, well, in medieval Europe, people simply threw the contents of their chamber pots out of the window onto the streets. Now before throwing the waste out of the window, they'd yell, gardez l'eau. The term gardez l'eau first came to English as gardy-loo, and then shortened to loo, which eventually came to mean the toilet itself. People in the Middle Ages were no less sensitive to foul odors or disgusted by human waste than we are. They also didn't understand exactly how human waste could spread disease, but they knew it, did. They just thought it was something to do with its odors. And hey, while we're on the topic of hygiene, in the early Middle Ages, women passionately cared about personal hygiene. Many townspeople took a bath, and there were a lot of bathhouses in towns. But due to the total victory of Christianity, life kind of changed. With all bathhouses being public, the church viewed it as a violation of moral standards. So then they closed them, and then untidiness was elevated to the level of virtue. Look, I'm a bit of a Christianity hater, so I'm just gonna leave that one be. Number 3, V-Day traditions. So during medieval times, they believed that if a young woman ate strange food on Valentine's Day, she'd dream of her future husband. And at a time where normal meals were delicacies such as a boar's head sewed onto a turkey's body, these weird meals were, well, extra weird. The roasted hedgehog was just one of the bizarre foods that these young women would enjoy in hopes of seeing visions of their future Valentines. Yeah, okay, because that's gonna make me gag, how about we do a little palate cleanser before we move on to the next bad thing? So other sayings that were popular at the time was if you saw a bluebird, you would marry a happy man. If you see a goldfinch, you're gonna marry a millionaire. And if you see a sparrow, you're marrying a poor man. If you find a glove on the road on Valentine's Day, your future beloved will have the other missing glove. Now by the 18th century, gift giving and exchanging handmade cards had become common practice. In England, handmade cards incorporating lace and ribbon became popular. And eventually this form of gift spread to the American colonies and into our traditions today. Also, it was found to be terrible luck to sign your name on a Valentine's Day card, and the superstition must have been very confusing for some folks, but convenient for others. As well as cards and flowers, the next gift to become popular was the giving of chocolates, and this can be traced back to Richard Cadbury, of yes, the famous chocolate-making family, who invented the first Valentine's Day candy box. Now, as those grew in popularity, chocolates started to be given in decorated boxes filled with, romantic imagery. I remember my first boyfriend got me a box back, way back when. It was a box of chocolates. I think my mom still has the box, because it was a really pretty box. Number 2, institutionalized. Okay folks, back to the icky stuff. Being sent away was a way to impose a pious life of no ownership or wealth, sexual relationships, any devotion to God, and administer healthcare and alms to the most unfortunate in society. In reality, it didn't always work. It was a way of kings, lords, and earls banishing troublesome wives, just to get them out of sight, out of mind. They could even do it to young that they didn't want to have around. Just a way of cleansing the soul, if you'd like. Hey look, if we're looking at the upside, a woman from aristocracy only had 2 options in life. Marry a man who could support you, or join a nunnery. Now, virginity was an integral requirement for a nun in the very early medieval period, because physical purity was considered the only starting point from which to reach spiritual purity. A nun was expected to wear simple clothing as a symbol of her shunning of worldly goods and distractions. The long tunic was typical attire, with a veil to cover all but the face as a symbol of her role as a bride of Christ. The veil also hid her hair, which had to be kept cut short. Nuns could not leave their nunnery in contact with outside visitors, especially men. That was kept to an absolute minimum. No temptation here. Granted, life isn't perfect. There was a couple of little scandals. I know there's one in mid-12th century, where at the Gilbertine Wotton Abbey in England, a lay brother had a sexual relationship with a nun, and on discovery of the sin, was castrated. It's kind of a common punishment of the period for that type of crime. Can we bring it back? Not for cheating, but for bad things. Number 1, take care of the monthly visitor. As someone who's currently dealing with my regular monthly episode of cramping and being a miserable witch, how women had to deal with this in history before modern products is very much evil in my book. So it was very much a vastly different experience than it is today. To start, medieval women had fewer periods than today's women. Poor nutrition and hard work meant that they had very low body fat, and a woman needs to have some sort of it, or her reproductive system slows down and menstruation ceases. In our modern words, for example, medieval women could use a makeshift, pad or tampon. Pads are made of scrap fabric or rags, hence that's where the phrase came from. Cotton was preferred though, because the material absorbs fluids better than the alternative, which was wool, which is also itchy and uncomfortable. There is some archaeological evidence to show us that some women may have worn panty-like garments, and they could also wind cotton fabric around a twig, and you make of that what you will. Interesting side note though, a common type of bog moss found throughout medieval England. Now the long official name I can't say, but the popular name was blood moss, and people realized that they could use it in the battlefield as first aid. So, put 2 and 2 together. Also, the main reason why medieval petticoats came in red, it was fashionable, decorative, but it was good at disguising accidents.
Punishment number 10 is ash bath. Just saying medieval times doesn't actually mean much. Every empire and kingdom had its own respective medieval time at different times than one another. So, Persia spanned from the 6th century to the 15th century, during which time they concocted some truly heinous punishments for those who did wrong, or at least those who did wrong in the eyes of whatever crazy leader was in charge at the time. Setting the stage for long-suffering death everywhere, Persia introduced such styles as forcing people to drink molten gold, tearing people apart with trees, and drowning them in ash. This punishment was one of the worst deaths you could receive, reserved for the worst criminals and those guilty of high treason or offenses against the gods, and it was horrifying. It consisted of throwing a victim into a 75-foot tower filled with ashes. You'd break a couple of bones, but it was a soft landing. From outside the tower, large hand cranks were spun by a team of men, sending the ashes flying and disrupting the solid pile so that the victim was pushed deeper and deeper down the tower, suffocating on burnt ash until they drowned in it. If you've dipped your toes in the Bible, you may know there's quite a few people that got this sentence in there, such as a corrupt Jewish priest whose family isn't allowed to bury his remains with a bunch of sassy snaps added. However, the concubines caught planning coups against their leader on several occasions met this fate too. Punishment number 9 is the evil field. So medieval Rome is characterized by the break with Constantinople and the formation of the Papal State, with technically ongoing until its collapse, which marks the beginning of Europe's medieval period. On the topic of being buried while still breathing, the Romans also enjoyed dumping people into holes alive in their medieval times. One famous example is the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of the hearth goddess Vesta who were sworn to chastity. However, should they break that chastity vow, they had a special acre of grass dedicated just to burying them alive. Like most deaths, Romans like to make a big show of it, and the Vestal breaking her virginity vow would naturally be the Sunday matinee. They had an entire little ritual. She'd be carried on a litter throughout the city in the nude until they reached the Campus Secularis, aka the evil field. There, an underground chamber awaited in which she'd be lowered into and sealed inside alive. There was only one ever known instance in Roman history where a Vestal Virgin wasn't slain for breaking her vows. That would be Julia Aquilia Severa, the wife, then ex-wife, then wife again, of Emperor Elagabalus. It's believed that Julia remained with him until they were killed in the year 222, but who's to say they put Julie in the ground after. Punishment number 8 is the finger cinch. China's medieval period was between the fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE and the fall of the Mongol Dynasty in 1368 CE. Famous in the Chinese feudal dynasty, this form of punishment was specifically made for the woman who did not obey her master's command. Master can be taken literally, should it be a concubine or a servant, but also figuratively like her parents or husband. The offenders have to put their fingers inside a specialized tool which look like interlocking combs. The device would then squeeze the fingertips, causing immense pain and loss of circulation. If the victim faints, ice water would be thrown on her as a wake-up call. The punishment would continue until the victim was deprived of all their strength. The device was prepared in every shape and size to crush the fingers of any female, so she may ultimately surrender to male prejudice. Punishment number 7 is the 4 witnesses. The Ottoman Empire was born very shortly, around 100 years at most, before the European medieval period started. As stated, it began when Rome broke from Constantinople, and thus it finished alongside the other European nations in the 16th century. How they punish adultery is akin to many cultures. Man cheats, no punishment. Woman cheats, world must be ending. The Ottoman criminal code did not distinguish between fornication and adultery. Zina was the word used for both, and both were unacceptable from a woman of any kind. And when caught in an alleged act of zina, in order to ensure the women were not wrongfully accused, the accusers required to produce 4 witnesses of good standing that actually observed the act of intercourse as it was happening. Imagine that. You walk in on your wife in bed with your best friend. So you have to run yelling into the streets for 4 people to come right now and see them while they're still hurriedly dressing, so you have some chance of getting her punished. However, even if you do manage to pull off 4 witnesses, if the witnesses can't be found at the time of the woman's trial, then the accusing husband will be flogged 80 stripes and ignored. So what I'm hearing is, as a cheating wife, you could essentially make the little problem go away if these 4 witnesses were to, I don't know, just casually disappear before the court date. However, on a terrifying note, the husband's second option when calling the 4 witnesses to his house is taking justice into his own hands. He can actually just kill his wife on the spot and face no punishment, nor require going to court, even if the witnesses didn't see the wife cheating beforehand. Punishment number 6 is marks and tattoos. European medieval period started with the fall of Rome in 476 AD and extended to roughly 1450. Meanwhile, a fun fact, the Americas never experienced a medieval period because a feudal system was never actually established in that hemisphere. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, protagonist Hester Prynne is marked with a red A to see her as an adulterer. This was practiced in a few regions of medieval Europe, such as Spain, France, even Britain. However, it was reserved for working girls and their keepers and continued well out of the medieval period until the Ancien regime. Women who committed the crime of Puritanism were branded with hot iron to show the world how frivolous they are. The working girls received a P on the arm, the booty, or the forehead, which I feel is a bit vindictive and personal. Meanwhile, the keepers were branded with an M, accompanied by a fleur-de-lis. King Charles IV even made them outlaws, stating that may all girls of joy and public women desolate from our court in said time under pain of whip and mark. After the establishment of the New World, which is out of the medieval period, but as stated, the Americas didn't have one, we see branding laws in colonies more akin to Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, such as the 1658 Plymouth Law that stated adulterers must mark every garment they own to identify them of their crime. Adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subjected to public whipping and further humiliation. So they colonized half the world for spices, but aren't the best at using them. It's sugar and spice and not so nice sauce. Spices were stupid expensive because Western Europe isn't exactly known for fiery flora or flavorful plants, and the only real means of transportation tended to die if you rode them too far, horses. So obviously you're just getting rare bits of dried herb brought back from crusades that you also have no idea what it is or how to use, and that's only if you're wealthy too. A lot of recipes described the peasants and even the wealthy seasonings as vinegar, ginger, garlic, chopped bread, unripe apples, and almond milks. AKA most people were limited to flavoring their foods with whatever BS they had lying around, mostly the tart or sour, leading to the modern British tradition of refusing to eat food that actually tastes like anything. Like spices, sugar was so expensive that it blackened rotten teeth became a status symbol. It was so coveted that when it finally became cheaper and more accessible to the average person in the 16th century, people went nuts. They were rolling meat in it, vegetables, animals and probably themselves. People tried to liven up their bland-ass food with sauces, but the limited access to dairy and tomatoes were still a twinkle in the eyes of the colonizers. And these sauces, they weren't the sort of thing you'd want to dip your pizza rolls in as a result. At the beginning of the medieval period, sauces were based on milk or wine or butter or simply the au jus, which emerged as part of the cooking process. Because bread was so important to the overall caloric intake and to maintaining the consistent mold and food poisoning that was killing them all, flour could not be wasted to prepare sauces and gravies, except on the tables of the rich. Their sauces were more like oatmeal, which you'd only serve on vegetables today if you want to ruin them. To give you an idea, one sauce is gruel, it's pounded oatmeal mixed with broth. Oh man, what a treat. Next up is beaver tails, but not the bannock type. Usually saying beaver tail, you think of that sweet, fluffy fried dough covered in sugar, maybe ice cream that's found at carnivals or amusement parks, or that hometown restaurant that sells them for $6.50 even though they're the size of your head. But medieval beaver tail? Whole different animal. Wait, well, whatever. Anyways, as discussed, medieval peasants were fasting like 3/4 of the year. That's a long time. So the church compromised by simply forbidding people to eat meat during fasting holidays, and then compromised further by agreeing fish isn't meat. But why stop there? People went even further by deciding certain parts of animals found in water that kind of looked like a fish, like a beaver's tail, counted as fish. Beaver tails were similar in shape to flatfish if you used your imagination. They looked like they were covered in scales and they spent a lot of time underwater, therefore they're actually fish. And they provided a cheap stand-in for the country's fishless poorer masses. But again, why stop there? The 17th century was no longer just the tail that was allowed on fast days, but the whole beaver itself. The beaver was a fish due to the fact it was an excellent swimmer. Unsurprisingly, the 17th century is the same year the beaver goes extinct thanks to overconsumption. Now the beaver is thriving once more again in England, Wales, and Scotland thanks to successful reintroduction programs from Canada, because we stay carrying that team. A medieval peasant walks into a bar and orders a drink and has to correct the bartender because they ordered a Cockail, not a cocktail. This hilariously named beer was made by tossing a boiled and crushed dead cockerel with 4 pounds of raisins, nutmeg, mace, and a ½ pound of dates inside a canvas bag. The bag was then placed in ale and left there to steep for 6 or 7 days. It was then bottled and kept still for a month, after which, ready for consumption. This was the most popular recipe as shared in a 1669 news article by Kelnan Digby. Why was this done to beer when it was already medieval times and it tasted bad enough? Well, it wasn't to produce dead chicken flavored beer, which is why strong herbs were there to overpower the chicken. The reason for ruining perfectly good beer with a giant chicken tea bag stemmed from the belief that the beer would be imparted with the cockerel's characteristics of strength, vigor, and courage. It was therefore mainly drunk by big manly men who wanted to be even bigger and even more manly. It was described as a pleasant drink, said to be provocative, aka it excited lust and aroused the body. In 19th century dictionary slang, Cockail was directly identified as a homely aphrodisiac. However, it naturally fell out of favor eventually for beer that didn't taste like dead chickens. I'm super angry about this one, but apparently it was only done in times of serious famine. It's roast cat. Cats were considered highly useful in keeping pests and vermin away. Dogs weren't so much of a commonplace thing, and usually they were the first to be eaten pet-wise when it came to serious food shortages. However, if the going gets tough, you have the option of hunting down some ferals in the woods to feed the fam. So, ever wonder how to roast a cat? According to one medieval recipe, you start off by cutting off the head and tossing it away, because it is not for eating. For they say that eating the brains will cause him who eats them to lose his senses and judgment. Then you do the cleaning. At this stage, the feline may look ready to roast, but alas, you must first bury it in the ground for a day and a night before you do. Then you unbury it, spit it, roast it, and whip it with a green stick. You can serve the roasted cat by soaking it in broth and garlic. To quote the end of the recipe, and you may eat it because it is very good food, which I feel like they threw in because they knew folks were not sold on eating dead ground food. And of course, what better to end this list than literal garbage, a real, literal actual name for a medieval dish. The historical food blogs are fighting for their lives to try and say this recipe is super tasty, and they've used the old recipe to make it at home. I do not believe you. I will die on this hill. This is probably the worst titled dish in history, and its ingredient list does not improve it. I have found 4 recipes, and each is just worse than the rest, all going as far back as 1393. So, most generically, you're gonna need all the worst parts of a chicken. You need the head, the livers, the gizzards. Throw them into a nice pot. pot, add fresh beef broth, powdered pepper, cinnamon, cloves, mace, parsley, sage, all chopped small. Then take bread, like actual bread. Just take a whole loaf and just put that in the pot. Boil it, then put it through a strainer, then boil it again. Add powdered ginger, verjuice, which is unripe apple juice, salt, and a little saffron. Then serve it forth. To have it English style means leaving the pieces of animal and chunks in there when you serve it. Having it French style is to strain it once more and serve it just as a thin broth. Imagine making it brothy soup style, serving that to your buddies before telling them afterwards what they ate.